Welcome to Sit Around the Fire, the podcast dedicated to the men and women on the front lines, first responders, military personnel, and their families. I'm your host, Ashley Dillard, and together we'll explore the challenges, the triumphs, and the real stories behind the uniform. In each episode, we'll talk about mental health, wellness, and the unique culture that comes along with serving in a high-stress environment. From building strong relationships to navigating the weight of the job, this is a space where we can be real, share experiences, and support one another. Whether you're on the front lines yourself or you're supporting someone who is, this is a podcast to remind you that you are not alone. So grab a seat, pull up to the fire, and let's get into it. Hello, everyone, and welcome in to the very first episode officially of the Sit Around the Fire podcast. I am once again joined by my co-host, Winston, who will be here with us today. And today I'm super stoked to be talking about one of my favorite topics in which we're going to kind of kick off this series around understanding what it means to be a master of our nervous system. And this is some work that I have really chosen to nerd out on and dig into because I'm very much one of the type of people who likes to try before you buy kind of scenario. So when I was first introduced into the work of neurosomatics and applied neurology, I thought, well, I'll give it a go myself, try it out for a month and see how it goes. And I was honestly, truly very impacted and changed by how such simple things, or even I guess just understanding how much our nervous system really does truly impact our thoughts and patterns and behaviors. So I'm excited to kind of dive into that today. In this episode, we're going to talk a bit about what does this whole nervous system, the brain and the body kind of mean? How does neurosomatics and applied neurology play into that? And then we'll follow up in future episodes coming up talking about some of the protective outputs of the nervous system, which we refer to as the 4 Fs. So you'll have to stay tuned to get some of that more information and understanding what that means. But today we're going to set the foundation for the basics. So let's dive in. Talking a little bit more about the brain and the body is that we have to understand that the nervous system really does pull the strings here. So nervous system work, it's super fascinating because learning more about this and then understanding as it moves through different people's lives is we have a really good time at our mind or our cognitive side of things dictating to us or explaining to us, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So for example, it makes a lot of sense for me to think in my mind, oh, I don't need to have anxiety. It's silly for me to have anxiety over this. But the thing is, when it comes to my anxiety, it really is a protective output of my nervous system, and it's trying to do the best for me. So it's defaulting back to what we literally refer to as the default mode network in terms of what it's always done for me in order to keep me safe and keep me alive. So having this concept or idea that the nervous system pulls the strings is understanding that everything that we do impacts our nervous system. And if we want to experience a new system of outputs in any kind of area of life, patterns, thoughts, behaviors, relationships, work, all of those things, is that we have to know how to work with our nervous system. If we choose to take the cognitive approach first, working with the mind, and sometimes this is where some of the traditional therapy models can run into some hiccups or some resistance, is because if we work with the brain first and then expect the body to be on board, it's not going to work as effectively for us. In fact, most of the time, like we talked about, the body is going to default back to the way that it's always done things before. So taking a different approach with the brain and the body is understanding that we need to work with the body and the nervous system first in order to create these new experiences, these new outputs that we actually want to have and to input forward in our lives. So the new inputs we have are going to really transform our thoughts and our beliefs and our actions. The old way of operating or doing things, or that predictable pattern that our brain loves to operate from, it no longer necessarily becomes the case. We now have these new networks and these new way of doing things that really open up things for us. It'll improve our mood and our mindset, our emotions, how much we react to things, and kind of some pre-established biases that we might have as well. And we'll talk a little bit more in the future about what this really looks like in terms of how far we do go back in when our nervous system picked up these messages very early on, and how those early messages are still impacting the way that we function today. So we want to take kind of what we know about the evidence-based psychology and combine it with the neuroscience side of things so that we can have new outputs in the way that we do things, in the way that we show up in life. And it's important to remember that there is nothing about the nervous system that operates in a flat line only. We experience two different ways of moving through the world, either in regulation or dysregulation. A dysregulated nervous system is going to look like an extreme amount of highs and lows. So it's either pie in the sky all the time, or everything is hitting the fan and the world's imploding on me. We rarely have conscious, prolonged states of calm. It's, if you picture just like chaos, whatever chaos looks like to you, that's what a dysregulated nervous system looks like. If we compare it to more a regulated nervous system, it's not going to be linear or straight either, because that's not how it works. We don't live in a world of rainbows and ponies where everything feels amazing and we're constantly in this euphoric state of bliss. But instead of these crazy highs and lows, these extreme peaks and valleys, a more regulated nervous system might look just kind of like a very small wavy line where we are still going to experience some highs and lows, some chaos, but our capacity for being able to handle that looks so much different, and it feels so much different in that regulated state. So I think it's important for us to also address and look at what exactly is trauma, and what does trauma do to us in terms of its impact on the body and the nervous system. So we can understand that trauma is just a protective response that happens when the body has received a perceived threat. So trauma, even we can relate it back to stress as well too, because they do feel very same to us in the body. It's too much, too fast, too soon. It's not just the event that caused this initial reaction in the system, but it's the long-term dysregulation causes that reaction inside the body to repeat after that event or a difficult series of events that's happened. And the really fascinating, complex thing to look at here is that this is not just an emotional response. This does not just trigger emotions related to the event, but it's actually a physiological nervous system response to a highly stressful event or a chronic stressful situation. So physiologically, if we look at this is going to be usually when we experience stress and trauma. This includes a huge influx of specific hormones, such as cortisol, adrenaline. They get dumped into the system. So when our body is in that state of trauma, even after just the first time, it's going to continue those repeated patterns of dumping in these stress hormones into the body. Now, this becomes something very interesting for us to look at as a first responder, because we are constantly inundated by too much, too fast, too soon. I mean, realistically, if there was ever a tagline you could give the world of first response, is too much, too fast, too soon on so many levels. So what is happening in our nervous system here is that it's having to constantly take in these information or these events and catalog them into the nervous system, making neurotags, which we'll talk again about here in the future. But it's going to repeat this pattern or this response as it adapts to these abnormal circumstances around us. when we experience that too much, too fast, too soon, this is where we see a lot of shutdown that can happen in the brain. The brain and the nervous system are so very divinely created and intricate that there are spots in the brain, neural pathways that can literally be closed down or shut off as a method of protection. So when we get into these repeated events or series, it's constantly shutting down more and more and more and more. So when people say like, oh, I have a hard time like even experiencing emotion, or I have a hard time even feeling anything, it's like, well, yeah, because your brain has literally shut off that part of accessing those emotions because it's a protective output. If we did that, it would be too much. The system wouldn't be able to handle it and function. So I think it's really important for us to understand this, because awareness around it is the first step to changing anything. So we have to pay attention and know, like, yes, this is something that's happening to us inside. And if you've ever read the book, The Body Keeps Score by Bessel van der Kolk, it's a really awesome book that puts a very easy spin on the way you can understand what stress and trauma does to the body. And I really particularly like this quote of his that he has is, trauma is an event that overwhelms the central nervous system, altering the way we process and recall memories. It is not the story of something that happened back then. It's the current imprint of that pain, horror, and fear living inside people. And I think this is a really beautiful way of looking exactly at what the impact of trauma is for us long term. And how he says it's not the story that happened way long ago. It's not that call that we ran on or that series of calls, but it is what is currently happening to us because of that imprint into the nervous system. Pain, horror, fear of living. Like I said, we'll talk about more of the 4 F's coming up in the episodes. But whether it's being in a constant state of threat all the time, anxiety, panic, wanting to control the environment you're around, or being hyper aggressive, hyper vigilant, whether it's withdrawing or shutting down, isolating, any of those things, even being a people pleaser is another bit of it. But those are all in response to what has happened within the system. That's why it is so, so important for us to work on it. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the types of trauma that we experience. When we think about acute traumas, which every single one of us living more than 10 seconds on the planet has some kind of acute trauma. And I would, I guess, argue to say being born is a trauma in itself. So acute trauma we look at as just a single event. It can be something like a natural disaster, a car wreck, some kind of violent incident. It's the one and done type scenario. Even broken down into as like stubbing your toe. Same kind of thing we're looking at. Chronic trauma is that ongoing repeated stress and trauma that can happen in childhood or in adulthood. So hey guys, thanks for taking the time to sit down and listen to the podcast. Whether you're actually sitting and watching or you're driving or multitasking, whatever you do, it's super awesome that we can connect with you around the fire. If you want to get further connected into the community that we talk a lot about here, I invite you to check out the link in the show notes below. It'll give you an opportunity to stay connected and at the forefront of all the communication happening. I'm going to send you something special to start working on your nervous system today, so keep an eye on your inbox. And now, back to the show. We, as first responders, are exposed to a high level of chronic trauma all of the time. Complex trauma, which is actually super fascinating, sometimes referred to as CPTSD, complex trauma, not currently diagnosable in terms of the DSM-5 quite yet, but I think like eventually my hope is, fingers crossed, that we'll get there one day and recognize rarely does any human being ever go through one single event of trauma, but rather complex trauma as an ongoing relational trauma where escape is not possible. So a long-term series of events that happen put us in that complex or CPTSD category. And then we have systemic trauma, which is just how our environment impacts. So that could be all kinds of different ways based on what that looks like for us, institutions around it. And those are all things that can impact our being, is in those states of trauma. So when we break back to CPSD, because I think it is important for us to talk about this, and I do have to share a funny story. One time, I have difficulty finding good therapists sometimes too, and I've been through my run-of-the-mill with therapy, and I was working with a therapist once who, she did a great job, and I think sometimes as first responders, we just require a very different breed of help. And so she was doing her best for me, and I very much appreciate that. But she came, I think it was back in our second or third session, she came back and was like, so I think you're going to qualify for PTSD. And I don't even know what my face or body language said in the moment, but I'm sure it looked like a no shit Sherlock type of moment, where it was like, I knew I could have told you before even becoming an actual therapist that I would qualify for a PTSD diagnosis. I think anybody who works as a first responder on the front lines or within the military, basically as soon as you sign on the dotted line, that qualifies you for a technical PTSD diagnosis. But what we fail to talk about a lot, or what traditional modalities of therapy fail to talk about, is this sense of really this complex trauma idea. And over time, it really becomes just an adaptation to survival in threatening environments, and displaying kind of where our attachment needs are not being met, our emotional needs or physical needs are not being met, as well as continued exposure to things that really nobody should ever have to seen on a daily basis. So rest assured, we will talk about CPTSD and be aware of what its impact is for us on the nervous system. So we have to take time to repattern what the present's going to look like. So if you truly want to make a change or a difference in your life, if you want to live in a different series of patterns and thoughts and behavior, is we have to work to change our mindset, our emotions, and our behavior, because we can't leave those in the past. So the classic story that we all try to play is, well, like that doesn't really bug me that much, or I've put that away and that is all good. And while I think that there is some merit to that and there's a process of handling it, is if you just decide to take everything and put it into a box and then put it in the garage or the basement, eventually there's not going to be any more space in said garage or basement. And then when you either choose to do a different career or you retire at the end of the day, suddenly you're left standing in front of this garage wondering what the heck just happened and how on earth did we become hoarders, because now we have piles upon piles of crap that we have chosen to not address. So the fallacy or the idea that you can go through a however long career, be it 2 years to 32 years, without addressing what has happened is wrong. And it is not going to serve you in the long run. And sooner or later, you are going to have to address what is in the garage. You are going to have to look at things. You are going to have to put it in a place. You're going to have to toss things out and decide what you're going to actually keep. But the idea that you can just shove it in the garage and be done with it, that's not real life. It is going to live in your body and your nervous system that is going to continually drive your behavior and your life experiences. So if you're experiencing any kind of struggle within your relationships, this comes back to a nervous system problem. What is being held in your body and your nervous system, be it from the job that you do, and or from earlier on, looking back to early developmental times, like this is driving your behavior now. So if you think like, oh, I'm having trouble in my relationships, I don't really know if I can trust people, it's making me incapable of being vulnerable with somebody or functioning well because I have this constant fear that the rug's going to get pulled out from underneath me. Well, surprise, newsflash, like that's not just because of the way that you are now. This is a long-standing pattern that's been developed within your nervous system. But the amazing thing here is, and the great news, is that you don't have to re-traumatize yourself every single time. You can learn to repattern these new ways. Now, this doesn't just happen overnight, and we didn't just get here overnight. So I think it's important to realize, like, you do have to be gracious and patient with yourself. And once you cross the threshold and start doing the work, if you really truly want to get better and live in a different way, you're going to have to commit to doing that. And it's not easy work by any means. But when we talk about healing, we think about healing as the ability to regulate and integrate into the present moment. So doesn't matter on what situation that you're in. You can always be a master of your nervous system. You can always choose to come back into the present, and you can take care of yourself, which again, we'll discuss more about what this looks like moving forward. But you can have emotional expression and regulation. And when you think about this, like, I know that sometimes there's a real stigma around experiencing emotion, or what emotions are, or can I even do that? Does it feel safe enough to do that? It's like you can rewire a new pattern into your nervous system where it actually feels really good to be able to process emotion. And it feels amazing to be regulated in your emotion. So we're not on this huge swinging pendulum of either, feeling like hypersensitive to emotions, or on the other side, completely shut down. What we think about as well with healing is an expanded capacity for stress with a positive adaptation. So we think about having a bucket, and we all have a bucket, and I call it the threat bucket. And there's always going to be a low level of stuff in the bucket because life is what it is, and we live in an environment with external stressors. So there's always going to be something within our bucket. But then we start adding in extra things like family things, or families in general, relationships and what those require, financial stress, work stress, things from the job start getting added in there, schedule requirements getting added in there, kids, all the things, et cetera, health problems, any of that kind of stuff starts to add volume into this bucket. And all of us, we don't have tons and tons of buckets. Once we hit capacity in that bucket, we've hit capacity. And so most people go around walking around in this world at capacity of their bucket. And so when stress or other difficult circumstances come to hit us, it's like, shoot, we have no more room. We have nothing left to give. Thus, we start to experience some more of these protective outputs on an even more magnified scale because we just don't have room for it. What this also does for us when we start to work to decrease the level in the bucket is that reactions to old triggers become a lot less. And not only do they become less, when they happen, they're way less impactful to us on a grand scale. So things before that may have hit us in a triggering way, within a nervous system that has been healed and regulated, it's not as impactful, which I know all of us would love to live in that state anyways. So the biggest thing too with healing is that we have to look at and decide what that looks like for us, and understand that healing and transforming is very personal to each one of us, and it looks so different to each one of us as well. And I love some of those memes and gifs that talk about like healing is not a linear process, because it's really not. Like understanding that we didn't just get to the spot that we are overnight, we have to also understand that we are not going to unwind everything that we've done overnight either. That this is going to be a process, and we have to give ourselves grace and compassion as we go through this process. So let's talk a little bit about what applied neurology looks like. And again, this is kind of where I nerd out and get really excited because it's the paramedic in me that loves the physiological pathophys side of things. But applied neurology is a non-invasive, non-medical approach to assess and train or retrain the nervous system. So this is where neuroplasticity comes really heavily into play. And if we picture neuroplasticity as kind of our brain being in a spot like Play-Doh, so it's very easily moldable or pliable. So these new neural pathways or these new ways of doing things, the new network that we're coding into play really becomes possible because the brain finally has an ability to change and adapt. So the old way of doing things is no longer the current way of doing things. And that is kind of what we look at when we work at changing the inputs coming in, as we're not going to be able to really do that. Like there is going to be things externally that hit us that come in that could trigger us or that cause a response. However, we can create new outputs, which will lead to new behaviors and thought patterns, et cetera, et cetera. So neurology is definitely linked to somatic healing. And when we talk about somatic healing, that's actually just for ease of understanding is working with the body. So causing the body to be okay with processing things and adapting to things. So at the fundamental level, our brain's activation signals, neural pathways, and firing patterns are all triggering out some kind of response from the body. Thus, that's why the book is titled The Body Keeps Score. Because no matter how we think, yes, we've handled this situation, or yes, I've seen so many dead bodies or these traumatic events, is yeah, that makes sense in your brain. Your brain has put that into a box and put that into the garage, but your body is still going to very much remember that. And it's going to take form in different ways. So all human change at its most fundamental level is a result of the changes in the nervous system of the individual. So if you find yourself at night struggling to fall asleep or having nightmares or experiencing bouts of anger or drive to substance use, whether it's alcohol or another form of whatever that looks like, excessive spending or et cetera, dangerous relationships, all of those things are ways that your body is trying to adapt to these inputs coming in. So when people say, it doesn't really bother me, the job doesn't bother me anymore, we still have to bring awareness around how the body actually does feel these things and what we're doing to support the body being able to process out the stress and trauma that's coming in. So the first step in all of this work, again, is just understanding. And we have to understand how the brain works. We have to understand how the nervous system works. And we have to have hope and drive that the neuroplasticity is still there. And it definitely can be. So one of the things I think is so powerful about understanding this is that you're never doomed to be in the same functionality that you are now. You can choose to live life in a different way. You can function at a different level of your nervous system. But we first have to understand that. And then we have to determine, okay, what the heck is happening and when is it happening? And this is where we'll dive into the 4 F's, the 4 protective outputs of the nervous system, because this is a really powerful way of getting real about how we're experiencing these things, what's happening in these protective outputs that's really kind of, as a result, these outside behaviors. And once we determine what exactly is happening, then we can choose to engage our nervous system in a different way. We can, what I call, be a master of our nervous system, so that when these protective outputs hit us for some reason, or they try to come back into play to protect us, we have different tools and ways to deal with them, so that we're not falling back into the same patterns and the same behaviors all of the time, the same protective outputs. So it's a little bit different in terms of what we do around this, is that we have to actually work with the nervous system. And like I mentioned earlier, this tends to be a little bit different than just like a cognitive behavioral approach to therapy, is that we're working really, really deeply with the body and understanding this. And we also work within understanding that there's parts of us that exist along with our authentic self. And this really allows us to get very specific and very targeted with what kind of goals we want to work on, so that we can have a really healthy career and we can process stress and trauma in the most healthy way possible. So, if your love life is starting to feel like you're on a call with no backup, I've got the dispatch for you. Join us live on January 11th at 10 a.m. for a workshop where we'll teach you how to navigate the minefield of romance with the finesse of a SWAT team. What's on the agenda? We're going to talk about how to diffuse criticism, end stonewalling, through mastering the art of not just responding, but connecting, even when you feel like you're behind a wall of silence. We're going to host a live Q&A after the workshop where you can bring your relationship woes and we'll troubleshoot like you're on a scene. If you can't make it online that day, we'll record it and we'll send it right to your inbox. That way you can review everything in your own time and convenience. Don't let your personal life feel like an unmanageable scene. Gear up for a better communication by clicking in the show notes below for the link to sign up for the workshop. Remember, this isn't just about saving others, it's about saving your relationship too. Registration for the course is open now, but closes on January 4th. Don't waste time, secure your spot. Now, back to the show. Understanding what exactly the nervous system does is, if you think about this as like a giant network within ourselves, so it's going to receive input from several different systems. These systems include the vision system, the vestibular, which is our hearing system, our sensory. So if you went to touch something, you're going to receive input on that, proprioceptive and interoceptive, which we'll get into as well too. Once it receives those inputs into the system, it's going to interpret that information and then it's going to make a decision. And this, again, is where right now we already have these predetermined Rolodex cards, as I like to call them, of what this was like before. This is probably what's going to happen again. So as it takes in this information, it's going off of what it has from predictability from the past. After it makes that decision on what exactly it's going to do, then it's going to generate an output. So this can be a huge scale in which we experience. So some of the positive sides, outputs on a positive scale would be things like great coordination and balance. Our immune system is top notch. Our hormones are doing super well. We have great sleep patterns and we're feeling very rested and waking up in a very energized state. Then we move down the scale thinking really like we can clearly think about things. So we're sitting in our prefrontal cortex where we can actually understand what other people are saying. We take that information in and we can actually understand that. We are able to be more regulated and process our emotions in a regulated way. We can be present, which is a huge thing if we think about what it feels like to actually truly be in the present and not either forward thinking, past thinking, etc., etc. We can make logical decisions. So this is where the left side of our brain, the logical side, can think through the steps of what it needs to do. It can make decisions that are not based out of emotion or survival. Pain-free movement is a huge one that we see in a regulated nervous system. And I know all of us would like to feel pain-free movement, as well as strength and speed. So amazingly enough, when we're overtraining our physical bodies and we start to move into a dysregulated state because we refuse to rest or we're not getting adequate enough rest, we actually start to experience the opposite of strength and speed, and we start to see degeneration and loss of strength because the nervous system is working against us. So no matter how much more protein you take or how much more creatine or whatever it is, pre-workout, et cetera, you're not going to see positive gains in this side unless you are actually doing your physical fitness in a regulated nervous system. Moving more towards dysregulation, we're going to see things like immobility, so that feeling really tight or having a hard time moving around. Migraines is a huge one too. So if you've ever experienced a lot of severe migraines, it's usually because you have dysregulation within your nervous system. Inflammation, which is a huge one. Inflammation causes all kinds of issues, as well as insomnia. So if you're having trouble sleeping or falling asleep, staying asleep, this is a sign that your nervous system is going to need some attention. And then we, like kind of the worst end of the scale, we start to see things like actual pain, anxiety, depression, fatigue, and then those 4 Fs as well too: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Those are kind of extremes on the extreme end of dysregulation. And just like we talked about earlier, like we're never just linear on the scale. We're constantly ebbing and flowing throughout it. So we could have good days where we are in a nice regulated state, and a trigger comes along and suddenly we're in full-blown dysregulation. But like we talked about, the goal is being aware of this so that we can change it. We can make a decision and a new output that we're looking for. So we got to understand exactly what these inputs are and what they look like. So the clearer, more accurate the inputs are, the safer the brain feels. So in other words, like the better the input, the new performance is in the output. So if we can clearly see what's coming in, or we can make sense of it in a clearer way, then the output's going to be much better. So exteroception is things like sight, hearing, smell, touch, and taste. Those are all the things we take in through the nervous system, through the five senses, as we call them, bringing information into the system. Interoception are the things that we're going to be aware of, bodily sensations and feelings. So those are the things happening internally for us. So that looks like our heart rate, our respiration, visceral organs, thermoregulation, tension or relaxation, and sense of ownership. So those are all the things that are internally happening to us. And proprioception is really quite interesting because it's the information that we're taking in that's kind of building a 3D map of our body in space and time. So it's understanding like where are we in this current moment in space. So everything from what does it feel like to be sitting on what I'm sitting? What does the temperature of the room feel like? What are the sounds that I'm hearing? But it's all sensory and motor components, as well as conscious and subconscious awareness. So it's kind of this whole package coming together. But the trick really becomes how we have to be able to feel our body and our movements in order to perform any kind of action towards this. So if we're living in a dissociated state, a shutdown state, or even a kind of flight, panicky type state, it's really hard for us to even be aware of what we're feeling and even being present within our body. So we have 2 concepts of what the brain looks like here. We have our new brain, which is designed for planning, conscious thinking, etc. And then we have the old brain. And the old brain is designed for automation. It's kind of the old, like when you think of old as like default, and it stores old habits, old patterns, and old beliefs. Now, on the limbic side of the system, we have to remember here that the brain's number one job for us is always survival. Each of these brain areas are going to contribute to that idea by protecting our physical body, protecting our ego and our emotional self, and by learning and adapting to pattern situations. So again, going right back into that Rolodex card of what has happened before, having a predictable pattern on the other side. So the executive part of the brain, which we refer to as the prefrontal lobes, the question that this part of the brain tends to ask is, what can I learn from all of this? So being in that prefrontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, is really that ability to understand, like, what do I need to learn out of this situation or these inputs that are coming in? The emotional side of the brain now is found in the limbic side, or the limbic system. And this really, really starts to develop even in utero, really, and then kind of gets reestablished and reaffirmed through how we've attached and looked to our caregivers or our primaries throughout life. But the emotional side of the brain asks the question, am I loved? So am I loved, by translation, means, am I going to be kept? Am I going to be accepted? Am I going to be validated? Now, the survival part of the brain is found in the brainstem. And this really drives a lot of the behaviors around, am I safe? So am I safe? Am I actually going to be kept alive? Now, when the executive side of the brain shuts down, it moves us into that old part of the brain, which goes right into the survival brain. That's right into the brainstem where it takes over. And it says, I call it like the lizard part of the brain is, what do I have to do to stay safe? What do I have to do to stay alive? The emotional part of the brain really kind of gets suppressed and shut off at that point, because all it can do is think about those two questions. What do I have to do to stay safe? What do I have to do to stay alive? And it's really quite fascinating when we see this play out in real time, because we can be having a conversation, let's say, with our partners, and all of a sudden we're triggered by something, or our partner is triggered by something, and then we go right into the survival brain, the lizard brain. And now we're not even making sense of what the other person is actually saying. We're interpreting and making up this information that isn't actually accurate. And so it really, truly is powerful when it comes to that old brain way of living, that survival side of the brain, because it's a default. It's a default way of doing things. But this is where we can actually repattern and rewire into a new way of pattern thoughts and behaviors. So I want to talk a little bit about, I think anxiety is a very easy one to look at, because I've never met a human being that has never had anxiety before or doesn't deal with it as a part of you. You are never anxiety, but you have an anxiety part. So let's say that we receive some kind of sensory input from the body. You can fill in the blank for something for you that you can think of that causes you to experience an anxiety response. So that sensory input comes in from the body, whether it's a trigger or whatever, an unknown set of circumstances, some kind of threat to the system. So what the default way of doing things, how this cascades throughout the body, is that the brain is going to pull off a previous experience. So how dangerous is this really? Do we have something that we can go back and look at that's happened before? Can we predict an outcome of how this will go? We also take into account what cultural factors look like, as well as social and work environment play into this. We have some expectations about consequences of danger and pain, and then kind of to sum it all in together, then our beliefs, knowledge, and logic come into play after that. So all along, the brain is taking in all of this information, and it's making a calculation around, do I have something to compare this to from before, and how dangerous will this really be? Making meaning out of everything that's happening, right? And then all of a sudden, if it doesn't have what it needs to have that full response and understanding, thus we introduce anxiety. And anxiety is just an output of the nervous system in fear of an upcoming threat. So what's it going to do on the output side here is we can experience physiological symptoms. Whether you get an upset stomach, you start sweating, your heart starts racing, your respirations increase, any of those kind of autonomic nervous system things get put into play. We can experience things like pain. We can start to get sick more frequently or get sick suddenly. Things like our immune system becomes compromised. And then our thoughts and feelings move along with that too. So the racing thoughts. And it's really pretty interesting when you look at this, because all this is trying to do when we break down anxiety is to keep us from going to do the thing that we're not sure is going to work out very well for us in the end. So when you break it down, to me, it feels a lot less threatening when we understand that side. But we have to understand what the capacity is when this threat level puts an output out for us. So we talked about like the physical pain side, anxiety, depression, inflammation, negative thoughts or feelings, flight, fight, freeze, and fawn, disassociating. We get dumped with adrenaline and cortisol, which makes us feel uncomfortable, breathlessness, brain fog, dizziness, vertigo, immobility, binge eating, alcohol or substance use, self-medicating, self-harm, immune dysfunction, hormone dysfunction, and insomnia. These are all things that come out of the nervous system as a protective output to say, hey, this threat doesn't feel okay. This input coming into the system is not okay. So we talked about earlier in the episode about the threat bucket and what this really means to us. The inputs that come in to the bucket, education, work, negative thoughts, emotions, nutrition, sleep, breathing, movement, balance, sound, all of those things coming into the bucket and coming out when we're overflowing. We don't have capacity to handle all that things. We're going to experience pain, and we're going to experience anxiety and depression and pain and procrastination and avoidance behaviors and fatigue and migraines, inflammation, dissociating, et cetera, because we don't have the capacity within our system to handle that. So this is where we have to start working with the nervous system. And again, why I'm super passionate about what this means for us as first responders is that because we have to start finding a different way of functioning if we're going to have healthy careers in the end, but also like if we want to have healthy home lives, we have to have a healthy nervous system. We have to be more regulated in dysregulating environments. So I know that was a lot. It was a lot for me, and Tiny is still sleeping. But I'm super, super excited to kick off this series around some of the nervous system work that we'll be talking about, as well as what this means to be a master of your nervous system. So keep an eye out for the next coming episodes, because we're going to dive deep into flight, fight, freeze, and fawn, understanding what those actually are as protective outputs of the nervous system and how to work with them. And also how to talk about them, right? How to bring them up with your crews or the people you work with or your families, your spouses, your partners at home. But how to actually have these conversations rather than just all of these negative outputs, these protective outputs coming out, and then not understanding the why behind any of them. So thanks for joining me today. Super excited to see you next time. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sit Around the Fire. We're excited to keep the conversation and connection going. I invite you to check out our website, link in the description below. Also, don't wait to get signed up for the upcoming workshop, Strengthening Bonds, working on efficient communication between first responders and their partners. You can sign up for this via the website or the link in the description in the notes. We look forward to sitting around the fire again with you very soon.